Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening, and I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight and to hear the second Fellows Lecture of this fall, and the first of two back-to-back, almost back-to-back American Political Economy lectures this semester. This evening's talk will be delivered by Chloe Thurston, Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University, and it will discuss the issue of how Americans became investors. Now, before I turn to our speaker and her interlocutor, I'd like to just say a word about the fellowship. The American Political Economy Fellowship was added to the Academy's roster through funding by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation in 2023. Now, I'm sure everyone here has heard of Hewlett-Packard, one of America's great tech companies, and that needs no introduction. In the best of American traditions, both the Hewletts and the Packards established terrific foundations with the wealth that they accumulated, and we feel very fortunate to have been funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Packard Foundation is yet to come. The American political economy movement, or school or sub-discipline, maybe Chloe will clarify that for us, is a vibrant new effort to study what its founders call, quote, the distinctive U.S. political economic mix, its sources, its dynamics, its consequences, and its contemporary evolution. In other words, those things that make American political economy really distinctive from the rest of the West. We're very fortunate to have two leaders of this new school of study here. One, our speaker tonight, and the other, our speaker next Monday, Jacob Hacker, who will address the future of the Democratic Party, a subject that may be that may hang in the balance today after today's leadership meeting at the White House. Our inaugural APE, American Political Economy Fellow, in 2023-24 was Margaret Weir, who was a professor at Brown University and who studied the enduring inequities of the American housing market, especially as it was distorted by race. We just feel very, very fortunate and grateful to Hewlett for their support. Unfortunately, Jacob, who I was hoping could add even more clarity to what APE is, could not be here suddenly tonight. He just was deterred from getting here, so it's going to either hang to Chloe or she's going to have to defer to her colleague Jacob to explain it. So we are also fortunate tonight in that Chloe will have an expert to talk to, and she won't have to do Q&A with me. And that will be done by Jim Tankersley, the Berlin bureau chief of the New York Times. I'll introduce him in just a second. Anyway, just to add to what you need to know about Chloe, she, as I mentioned, is associate professor political science at Northwestern, where she's also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research. From 2015 to 22, she was an assistant professor there, and prior to that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins. She did her PhD at Berkeley on access to home ownership. Her book, At the Boundaries of Home Ownership, Credit Discrimination in the American State, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Is that correct? And it received the J. David Greenstone Prize for the best book in politics and history. She is also the co-author of The Political Development of American Debt Relief, which was published in 2024. And her work has appeared in a whole array of journals, including Perspectives in Politics, Studies in American Political Development, the UCLA Criminal Justice Law Review, the Journal of Public Policy, and has been supported by an array of different foundations, including the Mellon Foundation and the DAAD. She received a Distinguished Teaching Award at Northwestern in 2022. Just to elaborate on the title, the research she's doing here at the Academy looks at the causes and consequences of the rise in mass investment in the U.S. and its relationship to politics and political culture from the New Deal through the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And while her project is centered on the U.S., she is looking forward to, and Chloe even speaks some German, she is looking forward to taking a comparative look at German social policy under the Schröder administration, its influence on German participation in the stock and housing markets. And so I don't get to do the conversation tonight, but I am going to inflict a personal anecdote on you. This is a big issue in my life, how Americans are all investors and Germans more or less are not. I mean, there hasn't been the same kind of mass cultural transition. And I am married to a German. She's now a German American. She's a dual national, but she came to the United States, foolishly following me when I moved back after being a journalist here. And shortly after she got her first job in America, my father said to her, and I love my father, it's not a criticism, do you have a 401k? Do any Germans know what a 401k is? Yeah? You know a little bit. Okay. And it would have been fine if he said that once. But this became a standard. And Dad, if you're watching, I'm sorry. I'm about to go to New York to celebrate his 90th birthday. I don't mean to pick on my father, but it was every family get together. And then it was along the lines of, are you pouring as much money as you can into your 401k? And my wife would say to me, what on earth is a 41k? And this went on for years and years, and she still hasn't forgiven me. Eventually she got the 401k thing, but it was, to me, a very telling instance. We tend to think that Western democracies are all converging in so many ways culturally, but the 41k was really beyond her. And there were some rough moments early on in family history, but we'll move right along. Anyway, Jim Tankersley will be Chloe's interlocutor, so you don't have to hear more relevant anecdotes like that. Jim came to Berlin to lead the Times office only in November of last year. I thought it was even more recent. And he oversees coverage of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. He writes about foreign policy, society, politics, migration, energy, all kinds of government reforms, and as well as populist movements and the like. And he's got a great job because being a foreign correspondent is as good as it gets. He was previously White House correspondent, much tougher, and a tax and economics reporter for the New York Times, and he covered economic policy in Washington for 10 years. He has worked for papers including the National Journal, the Rocky Mountain News, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. And I think there's some overlap in expertise here because in 2020, he published a book entitled The Riches of This Land, The Untold True Story of America's Middle Class, and covered the stagnation of the American middle class and the decline of economic opportunity. Thank you so much for doing this tonight, Jim. So I'm going to turn over the microphone to Chloe in just a second. She will speak for about 20 minutes. Then Jim will join her on the stage for a discussion, and then they will open it up to the audience. If you would like to participate in the discussion and pose a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone. Please wait for the microphone. Please also make sure your question is indeed a question. And if you are joining us via Vimeo, please type your question in the Q&A part of the platform. Chloe. Oh, by the way, I meant to say, if you want to know more about the American political economy movement, this is the manifesto, and both Chloe and Jacob have contributions to it. And Jacob's one of the editors. So, Chloe, it's all yours.
Sorry, can everyone hear me? Great. Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, Dan, for the introduction. And just before I start, I know I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to go really fast with this. But I can't start without thanking the staff at the American Academy for welcoming me and my family here for this short time, and to my colleagues at the Academy, too. It's been a really great intellectual experience here. To Jim for agreeing to moderate and to kind of inject a little bit of fun into can be a dry discussion, but it won't be, I promise, about 41Ks. And to you for showing up, because unfortunately, despite the title, I'm not going to be giving any stock tips. So what I will do, though, is give a bit of an overview of a book project that I'm currently working on while I'm here, and I've been working on since before arriving here. And that's about, as Dan had said, the rise of a mass investment political culture in the US and sort of what it can teach us about the changes that transpired in the American political economy since the 1960s, with lessons for today, too. And so I'm like I said, I promised not to keep this to time. And so I want us to think back, if you can, to Liberation Day. Not this Liberation Day, July 4th, but this one. This was April 2nd, 2025, and that was the day that President Trump freed Americans from the yoke of China and the EU and other countries' tyrannical trade practices, right? He announced sweeping tariffs across the globe. Almost immediately, this sent the U.S. And global stock markets into a tizzy, right? We saw the sharpest decline since COVID in 2020. And this turned into a public panic rather quickly as well, too. Consumer confidence fell. Public opinion towards Trump's ability to control the cost of living, already underwater by that point, fell further underwater. It threatened to metastasize into the bond market. And a week after Trump announced Liberation Day, kind of quietly backtracked and said he would pause the process. And so it seemed for a moment, at least, like the potential for political blowback led the administration to scale back. So, and I'm glad that Dan drew sort of a personal contrast, because I wanted to think about a sort of a broader one too, and that's to contrast the public panic in the United States with the reaction of the European public, which seemed to respond to the volatility with something like a collective shrug. This is just one headline from a couple of weeks after. Again, it wasn't that the European markets or global markets were particularly insulated, but the public didn't seem to find this volatility to have the same resonance as in the US. It wasn't a mass political problem in the way that it almost immediately threatened to be in the US. And the little summary below gets at some of the explanation for that, right? Europeans tend not to invest. They tend to hold more of their assets in cash and savings. They've indicated in surveys that they're more uncomfortable with the risk of investment. And even those who might be comfortable find that there are far fewer opportunities to get involved as sort of a small individual. There are fewer options and also higher fees, 60% higher than their US counterparts. And so by contrast, a record 58% of American households owned stock in 2022. And in general, Americans face a higher sort of range of options and a wider variety for lower cost involvement in different forms of investment, as well as things like crypto, kind of more. Yeah, I liked that. I saw your eyes roll and kind of feel the same way, but we're going to get there too. But in addition to that, Americans have also been found to have adopted a more financialized mindset on other goods as well, higher education, or you can see here housing, sort of the increase in home equity being something that you can tap into, you can use to pay for other things. Again, housing, you can have a bungalow or a blingalow, as this ad from the early 2000s suggested. This has not always been the case. In the wake of the Great Depression, Americans were understandably reluctant to invest. A survey just 10 years after this cartoon revealed only about 29% of Americans had a favorable view of Wall Street. And in the aftermath of the Depression, key New Deal policies ushered in by Franklin Roosevelt and congressional Democrats, but then ultimately acquiesced to by Republicans, starting with Eisenhower, ensconced a set of governing ideologies and institutions that created a firewall between investment and savings, that created firewalls that made it so that, again, it would be difficult and also somewhat unnecessary to tap into the wealth accumulated in your house to pay for other things. Sorry. In this period, few invested in the market, but in return, Americans also saw a period of economic stability and wage growth, and those enabled participation in the mass post-war consumer society. So this would begin to change by the 1970s. And again, the title of this talk is How Americans Became Investors, What Changed? And I'm thinking about this for this project in two questions, actually. So the first question is, how was it that Americans once again came to participate in the economy in the mid-20th century or starting in the later 20th century, not just as wage earners, but again, as investors and asset holders, much like they had before the Great Depression? And then second, how did the idea of Americans as investors come to reorder American politics and political culture, political competition in the late 20th century, with implications for today too? And so I'm going to tell this story through the lens of two people who had a front row seat to these transformations. They're not the only people, but I think that their experiences help to provide sort of a useful view into those transformations in the American political economy at the time. The first was a true believer in this idea of the democratization of investment, that you could make things cheaper, you could bring investment to more people. And the second was a political strategist, a Democrat who had seen in the wreckage of the New Deal order a new means for his party to, again, win electoral majorities. And this time that would be found by tying the pursuit of mass investment to loftier ideals present in the American political culture for decades, even centuries, ideas about risk-taking, bootstrap individualism, freedom, but also ways to sidestep really tricky distributional tensions that were weighing the party, and to try to capture the American political terrain for the foreseeable future. So first, the entrepreneur. So John Bogle was born in 1929, so the same year that cartoon I just showed you came out. And he came from a wealthy family, except that his family was a casualty of that crash in 1929. And this led his dad to turn to alcoholism, and Bogle and his brothers to end up moving in with their grandparents and starting to work early to support their family. Jack ended up at Princeton in 1947. And one day when he was in the library there, he happened upon an article in Fortune magazine, and it talked about the sort of new mutual fund. And, like college students tend to do, he became obsessed with this mutual fund idea. And he ended up writing his senior thesis in 1951 about sort of how he thought mutual funds could be improved. And he had some ideas that they should be efficient, they should be economical. These are his words. They should be run for the benefit of the investor rather than for the ability of managers to kind of maximize the fees that they could collect. And so the thesis caught the attention of a legendary mutual fund pioneer. He was offered a job as soon as he graduated. He climbed for 2 decades, was fired from the same company he led, but then he used that opportunity of his firing to actually make some progress towards those ideas that he had elucidated in his senior thesis in 1951. He explained to a group of Wharton students in 2003, some decades after, that the idea would be that rather than trying to claim that you could beat the stock market with all of the sort of right information or sort of the pizzazz necessary, why not just create an index fund? Why not just base all of the stocks on the S&P 500 index? You could make this low cost. You could eliminate the seller-driven expensive model, and you could democratize finance. So John Bogle founded Vanguard. He created and introduced the first index fund in 1975, and immediately learned that his compatriots did not necessarily think the same way that he did. This was called Bogle's folly. It was called un-American. You can see here he was chastised for settling for mediocrity. He tried to raise $150 million in the IPO and only managed to raise $11 million. And yet it was Bogle who would end up having the last laugh, because Vanguard did become one of America's largest and most influential financial firms in what would ultimately become a $5 trillion industry. Bogle himself would achieve somewhat of a cult status among small investors. He was kind of like the early finfluencer, or I don't know, Bono, if that is someone who has a cultural catchphrase. But this was a period when the economic conditions that underlied the New Deal order, the ones, again, that had promoted a sort of more stable, less risky, fewer sort of opportunities for investment, were no longer holding. In 1960, fewer than a quarter of American households were invested in the market. But in the 1970s, a combination of high inflation, wage stagnation, and most importantly, the transformation of employer pensions from defined benefits to defined contributions, and ultimately the 401k, if Dan's here, pushed more people towards new financial products to try to manage these risks, towards the use of money market accounts as an alternative to high-cost savings accounts, to new mortgage and home equity products that would allow people to draw from the value of their house, and perhaps more importantly, towards the use of mutual funds and index funds like Vanguard to help manage the new decisions that would need to be made by this accidental class of investors who suddenly finds themselves needing to make in charge of decisions about how their retirement is going to be invested, what their stability in retirement is going to look like. And so lest this be a story about intrepid entrepreneurs, it's important to point out that all of these new financial products that consumers availed themselves were also shaped by political actions, by the actions of people in regulatory bodies like the SEC or the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They were also shaped by new changes to public laws. But something to point out is that these, while not outside of politics, were often subterranean, in the words of my colleague here, Jacob Hacker. They weren't overtly partisan for the most part. Many went unnoticed. These changes kind of became noticed down the road when they suddenly became important. Again, Americans, to answer that first question, turn towards credit to manage stagnant wages. They turn towards investment to manage inflation, and turn towards, or were pushed towards, mutual and index funds in the wake of the transformation of pensions, all so that by 1994, people like the financial journalist Joe Nocera could write of a sea change in Americans' behavior, an astonishing transformation in the financial habits of the middle class. So what I want to turn to for the second part is a discussion of how these movements by households into finance, into investment, actually reshaped American party politics and democracy. Because in the wake of these changes, political actors on the left and the right attempted to forge a political identity around investment. That is, to encourage citizens to think about their role in politics and society through the lens of their role as investors. To even do things like evaluate the quality of a political incumbent's performance, or the quality of a challenger's policy pledges through the lens of how that might help or hinder their financial and political interests down the road. And so this was party building for an age of stagnant wage growth. And where you can see this the most clearly is in the role of the Democrats. Now, my colleague Jacob Hacker is going to talk more about the role of the Democrats on Monday. He has promised that he is going to discuss, and I think solve, the challenges of the Democratic Party. He's not here tonight, so I think he's finishing up his solution. But I'm excited. Had on their hands in the mid-1980s, and that's the Reagan Revolution. So in 1980, Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter with just over half of the popular vote. He carried 44 states. 4 years later, he increased that lead. He won by 60%, or he won with 60% of the vote. He carried 49 states against Walter Mondale. And so in the aftermath, we saw something very similar to what we might see now with Democrats hand-wringing, soul-searching recriminations. And this gets to the second person. So this is Al Fromm. He was born in 1943 in South Bend, Indiana. He graduated from Northwestern, go Cats. In 1965, he was the editor of the Daily Northwestern newspaper, and he got into politics shortly after he graduated. He worked on the war on poverty for a decade. He worked on a Senate committee. He spent 2 years advising Carter on inflation, and you can tell in his papers that this problem, the political problem of inflation, and the problem that it creates for incumbents, for political parties, and for really any ability to use policy effectively and still win elections, was seared into his mind. And so in the wake of Mondale's wipeout, Fromm, along with other colleagues, went on to found a new organization. And the idea here was to set out and create a newly competitive Democratic Party. The organization was called the Democratic Leadership Council. And their thought was they would modernize messaging, they would create new policies to try to revitalize the party. This would be accomplished in partnerships with academics, by relying on survey professionals, and also by learning from the few Democrats who were managing to still win elections in southern and western states. And so what the organization came to was the belief that if the Democratic Party wanted to rescue itself from electoral college oblivion or national oblivion, it was going to no longer be able to count on the coalition and the appeals that it had made in the decades after the New Deal. That formula of market regulation, of progressive taxation, of redistribution, and civil rights no longer seemed to be delivering the votes that they had expected. And so they would need to adapt to, quote, new realities, flat wages, disillusionment with the idea of government regulation, taxation, and redistribution among the public, and a sense that Democrats were captured by special interests, which the DLC tended to view as labor unions and minority group activists. So rather than emphasize wage growth, the emphasis would be on sort of new tools and resources that would let people share the benefits of a growing economy, a growing pie. And they talk about this in an early strategy memo. Fromm laid out what his new governing vision, or the new governing vision for the party, could look like, writing, quote, incentives should be provided to help citizens organize their resources for key family and personal investments, college, training, home mortgage, business, startup, retirement. And why? Because, quote, offering citizens opportunities and other services in this way reduces traditional voter disenchantment with government over issues of control, accountability, and quality, and should even lead to greater levels of civic participation. So this became incorporated into the politics of Clinton and other New Democrats. And initially, there was a broad-based conception of the idea of investment to include something called social investment, spent in training and research and development. But eventually, it winnowed down, as sort of policy agendas tend to do. And what remained was asset building for the poor, later to include homeownership targets, then goals for participation in the stock market and for small business ownership. But what Fromm and others in his party and in his part of the party saw was a promising way to sidestep distributional, social, political, fiscal conflicts that seemed to serve on a drag on his party's competitiveness. And an indication that they thought that this was a way to invigorate the party, that they thought that this was a winning strategy, was that they saw George W. Bush's campaign theme of compassionate conservative as a direct effort to co-opt their message. They actually thought he was stealing their message, as he describes in this 1999 memo. The battleground in 2000 is going to be for the ownership of this type of politics. The Republicans get that this is a winning formula. They're being blatant in that. They've actually kind of stolen our thunder here. It continues on, too. He says, I believe it's likely that the Republican Party in 2000 will not be defined by the nutty right-wing impeachment-crazed jihad in the House, but rather by a presidential candidate representing the centrist, pragmatic GOP governors. And so that part maybe didn't play out very well in the long run. But in the short one, he was right. The Bush agenda, the compassion agenda, did seek to incorporate some of the same priorities about investment, for homeownership, went even further in terms of partially privatizing Social Security as one of the campaign promises. But it bears mentioning that, again, it's helpful to think about these in terms of how party leaders saw these as accomplishing party building goals. Because, again, Bush's advisors, much like Al Fromm and the DLC, also saw this as a strategy for incorporating a newly invested middle class into their coalition, for making inroads with a growing number of Hispanic voters who still seemed politically up for grabs, and to cleave off conservative, investment-oriented African-American voters, too, who had continued to vote for the Democratic Party despite having some ideological differences. And so both parties see themselves as using this as a strategy to cleave off those centrist voters. And this is what I mean when I say that politics became, to some extent, reordered around these. Once both parties are thinking in similar terms, then you've seen something seismic in how political competition is conducted. So this speech was in 2005, the beginning of Bush's second term. Bush ended his term in the midst of a deep financial crisis. And so at the time, onlookers declared this the end of the ownership society, right? It's not actually what happened, though. The financial crisis generated an immediate reckoning with the downsides of going all in investment. One's assets can lose value, and they can lose it quickly. But by most measures, interest has rebounded. Participation in the stock market and relatedly in retirement accounts is at record highs in the years since COVID. Young people especially, this has been very stark. There's been a six-fold increase in 25 and under-year-olds' participation in investment accounts from 2010. There are new products proliferating, including crypto, including the sort of cheaper and easier to use brokerage accounts. And this has created the kind of environment for people to, again, embrace these kinds of tools. And once again, policymakers, too, are continuing to tout their role in creating and supporting a climate of investment. So here you can see in 2020, Trump using the 409k, which doesn't really exist, as the performance as a reason to continue to reward him at the ballot box. In 2024, both political parties' nominees announced cryptocurrency strategies, again, as a way to bring in young, often minority, often male men into their coalition. So that recent shift requires us to think a little bit more about what to make of headlines like these. So this year, this was 2021, this happened again in 2022. Pensions and also house prices, so two big asset classes for most people, their growth far outpaced wage growth. How to think about this development, though, as it relates to the ideals of folks who wanted to democratize finance and who wanted to incorporate citizens into politics as investors, requires us to grapple with a few different questions. So I've got to keep this to time, so I'll leave us with just a few thoughts. And so one is participation in this investors' republic is broad, but it's not particularly deep. Generally, people have small amounts of money. So when you talk about sort of the huge participation or these big gains, it also is important to think about the fact that most Americans' individual retirement accounts are severely underfunded. So someone who is thinking about retiring right now, 55 to 65, probably the median sort of value of their 401k is $95,000. It's not enough to live on. Also, rising participation in the stock market can also be a signal of problems in the safety net more than a substitute. And we see this when we delve into the reasons for why people participate in crypto. It's a risky investment strategy. And one of the reasons that people participate in it is that they say that they need to catch up with retirement savings. And then finally, it gives rise to questions about political consequences that we haven't grappled with so far. Insider-outsider dimensions, especially conflicts between homeowners and renters, intergenerational politics around wealth and especially taxation, and questions of government responsiveness. Does participation and mass participation in things like crypto or other types of investment programs create some sort of political constituency for industry bailouts? And if so, does that encourage unwise risk-taking by the same industries? So these weren't the questions that were animating the political boosters in the 80s or the 90s who just thought about this as a party-building strategy and a kind of a simple one. But they're questions that nonetheless animate our politics going forward. Okay. Hello.
Hello. Okay. Thank you all for being here. That was great. I have so many questions.
Great.
Let's go.
Can you
fast.
hear me?
Yeah. Because I know everybody has lots of questions too, but we are both people who care a lot about middle-class Americans, and we are both spent a lot of time thinking about the mythologies around the middle class. And I'm curious, just listening to the talk, do you think that the mythology for the American worker has shifted over the last half century from if you work hard and save money, you can get ahead, to if you invest enough the right way, buy the right house at the right time, invest in the right stocks, you can be wealthy?
Yeah. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Just checking. I almost hit myself with this. But yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that the mythology of the American worker has shifted in part because there's been this adoption and kind of linguistic shift from worker to investor as well. Just, what does a citizen do? Do they work? Do they invest? But what I've seen in my work, and also in some of the other research that I've discussed as well, is this sort of shifting emphasis on returns to investment. And one of the reasons I think that ended up being the case was that for some time, those were kind of where the big sort of valuable economic changes that someone in office could point to if they're trying to make an appeal to get someone to vote for them. I'll say one other thing, but I know we have to go really quickly. And that's that, I think the other reason that kind of language, though, worked is that it's appealing to something that's actually much more deeply rooted historically in American society. And that is this sort of idea of sort of freeholding citizens or land ownership as being the sort of prerequisite for full citizenship. It's one of many different American political traditions, and something that kind of has been dominant sometimes and recedes, and then you see sort of some inklings of that too.
Okay, so then to build off that, how has the sort of ethos of the American investor survived a couple of big hits from the presidents you mentioned? Bill Clinton presided over an enormous amount of stock market wealth creation, and also the dot-com bust. I mean, I had college classmates who went to work for startups that were paying them amounts of money we had never thought possible, stopped out for a year, their company went bankrupt, and then they just came back to school. But Clinton did. I mean, Gore didn't win that election, but Clinton didn't seem to pay like a reputational price for that. Why? And same with Bush and why was there not a bigger backlash to the homeownership policies after the crash?
So I guess I would push back a little bit on the backlash post financial crisis, in part because we're still trying to make sense. It takes a really long time to make sense of what's really transpired. And there are a lot of political scientists who are finding that a lot of the sort of contemporary challenges that we're seeing now, the rise of the far right in certain places, sort of the return even to just sort of nativist or revanchist politics, is tied to some economic anxieties that came out of the housing crash. So
Totally.
yeah. Oh, sorry.
But there wasn't the anxiety. Like, people still want to be homeowners, right? That's the thing that hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard because I think in the U.S. it's kind of just your choice, right? It's just kind of the main way to the main form of housing tenure, and so I think leads to a few different things. One is it kind of means that this ideology of home ownership kind of persists regardless of sort of the ups and downs of the housing market. It might explain sort of why, even in the aftermath of pretty severe recessions, it comes back as being something that people aspire to. On investment more broadly, I would say that one of the things that we found is that younger people seem to be more drawn to a lot of these different kinds of products. And so that might just be, a function of them not having the experience that your friends and classmates had, right? They just didn't live through that. And as a result, they're kind of coming to this without thinking through the sort of downside consequences more.
But then in the midst of all of this, as your slide showed, Bush tries to do this partial Social Security privatization, and it's widely considered the turning point for his presidency when things started to go south. What happened there?
Went too far. He did. It was deeply unpopular. And so, again, there was this sort of movement where both political parties are trying to get more people to invest. Again, it's a good way to sort of move the ball a little bit if wage growth isn't the only, is a difficult sort of indicator to point to. But the terrain of political contestation moved to talk about all of these different areas of investment didn't necessarily mean that there weren't huge limitations to it. Turns out people actually really like Social Security. They think about it as a savings account because you pay payroll taxes into it. So you expect it to be available, pretty predictably when you need it, when you're retired. And so that just turned out, and it had long been considered to be the third rail of American politics. And I'd say my opinion is he just kind of got politically greedy. It wasn't something that was a realist. You could have pushed for a lot of other forms of asset building, but that was the least realistic one. Senior citizens are also just an incredibly well organized set of advocates too, and so they pushed back very fiercely and in very visible ways too. They went to all of their congressmen's town halls, for example, and protested, and just very clear. There was a very clear signal that we're not going to accept that degree of financialization of this public benefit.
Okay, so now back to our mythologies,
Yeah.
right? One thing that happens as people lose this sense that you can work hard and keep getting paid more and more and really get ahead is that you also are seeing fewer and fewer workers have traditional defined benefit pensions, like the big corporate safety net that you could retire into. And so the salience of investment accounts starts to go up. Do you think that's an act, like what's the driving force there? Was the DLC responding to that, or did it sort of give political permission for that to happen?
So that's a good question. I think they're coming kind of in the wake of that. That's already kind of happening, and so I think the DLC and later you see with Bush too. They're reacting to something that already is largely underway. That would be a sort of difficult to stem the rise of 401ks or defined contribution plans. They're not really creating that so much as sort of saying, well, let's incorporate this into how we make appeals to the public, how we think about policy.
And then the other crazy thing that happens after not crazy, very rational thing that happens after the financial crisis is that you see American trust in big corporations, which was already on its way down with outsourcing and eliminating of jobs and pensions, crater for at least a while, and particularly in financial firms. But the investments with those firms don't crater. How do you explain that?
I can't. No, this is the paradox. No one can explain it. But, well, I mean, maybe there are explanations. Maybe people in the audience have explanations. But the paradox is we see really high participation now, kind of record levels, depending on what it is you're looking at, but in just sort of small investing and having a 401k or a defined contribution plan. At the same time that trust in finance, trust in sort of business in the abstract, trust in government too, are at kind of extreme lows. So, why do we see that? It's not entirely clear. Maybe you have a thought.
I don't. No, I mean, my thought would be that people have like perhaps when you are investing in an index fund, you're not thinking about the companies that are running it. When you're doing an E-Trade account, I mean, you are maybe like some individual traders are doing that a lot, but other Americans are just trying to get into stocks or whatever, and that's not. It's different somehow than giving money to a company to invest in an IPO or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so people tend to not, again, sort of there's a lot of participation. Borrowers haven't necessarily become more sophisticated consumers of information about financial products or of information about the underlying sort of, firms or even the political regulations or changes that might matter to how they think about the stability of these types of investments. So yeah, maybe that actually does make it, facilitate sort of participation. Maybe if you thought a little bit more, you thought that the barriers were higher that you needed to, maybe you would participate a little bit less, I suppose. I guess the other thing is it might just kind of seem to be something, the viable thing to do with money that you might have lying around. So younger people, again, they're participating at kind of higher rates than they have historically in the last 15 years. And so one of the reasons that many think that that's happening and that people have pointed to in public opinion surveys and what have you is that they can't buy houses. And so they actually do have some extra money that they would have maybe used for a down payment. And so if sort of these vehicles are their only option, why not just put your money there and not even really think about those underlying important questions about whether they're safe? Because what are your other alternatives?
Yeah. When I started, and interest rates have been low for so
Yeah.
long, but when I started covering economics, political economics, full time, shortly after the crisis, the general sense in political science research was the stock market wasn't a real driver of voter behavior. That was gasoline prices, right? That's the big unemployment. But is it today? Is it more of a driver?
No, we don't know that it is. It's clear that politicians kind of worry that it might be. It's clear from the work that
Any in particular you can think of who are really
yeah, right. Well, and there's a question and something maybe to kind of grapple with. It doesn't seem like maybe the person you're thinking of is worried about it as much as they should be.
Were we talking about Friedrich Merz?
Oh yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, no.
These are the politicians.
No, I think that there was sort of like an anecdotal sense that Trump maybe actually did care a lot about the stock market. He certainly touts it. Lots of politicians tout the stock market when it's something that that's performing well that they can claim credit for, because politicians like to claim credit for things, right? You can also see that in their own sort of strategizing, they think about ways to claim credit for these things. There's a difference between that, though, and whether it actually affects voter behavior. And there it's not as clear. We actually, I think the political science literature, like you said, as for the most part said that that's not a great predictor of actual voter behavior. It's possible that that won't be the case in the future, or if we go back and kind of look at politics today. And there are a few areas where it might be predictive. Stock markets, sure, they're not. I think that there were sort of a lot of unrealized hopes that these politicians had with sort of trying to get people to think about these other metrics. House prices, though, do seem to be important for a variety of political sort of important electoral outcomes, voting behavior. So that might be one area where it does matter.
Do Americans still seem to expect their houses to be investment vehicles?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like right now, today, but yet largely there's still an expectation that houses are safe investments, and usually the way that that's defined is something that you can expect that not only will it hold its value, but it should grow in value, and that's something that you might be able to draw down that equity for other reasons, to pay for college or things like that. I don't know if the sort of extreme, the idea of sort of almost an exponential growth of house prices is something that people are still expecting. But the sort of general sense that house prices don't go down is something that, again, despite evidence, right, and kind of recent evidence in the last 15 years to the contrary, hasn't really been abandoned.
I'm building towards something here,
yeah.
but I want to stop close to the top and ask, can you explain to us the sort of role right now of crypto in the American investor psychology and American politics? Just briefly.
It depends on which investor. So I don't understand why the industry exists. We were talking about this earlier. It kind of seems like a vehicle for money laundering and other kind of unsavory types of practices. But when it comes to the small investor who is investing in crypto, there are a few different motivations. And so one is that it's just kind of like fun. It's kind of like sports betting or just some other kind of, fun thing that you do. You heard about it maybe on a podcast or, some sort of social media thing. Maybe you talk to your friends about it. It's kind of a social thing. It's not really considered an investment. It's considered consumption. There's another group of investors that see this as a way that they understand that it's risky, but they see it as a way that they might be able to make up for to catch up for sort of perceived lack of security for old age retirement. And so this has been found. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas had an interesting report on this, and they found that among African Americans, and I think this is particularly among males, crypto participation was actually higher, much higher than participation in index funds and stock markets. And one of the reasons that was given was that they disproportionately felt like they were not where they needed to be for their retirement savings. And so this was almost like kind of like a Hail Mary sort of, it might not work out, but could work out splendidly as well. And that could solve this issue.
And we're in this moment where in the States, the sports gambling has exploded. It's partly a regulatory story, but also just partly that people are consuming it as entertainment, but perhaps also as their perceived investment in this way. Do we see in the data a change in sort of risk appetite among investors that would suggest more of an embrace of gambling, of crypto, of other sort of high risk, high reward?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, you see this in terms of who participates. There seems to be more in crypto. I don't know about sports betting. There seems to be sort of an indication of sort of like more acceptance of risk, sort of, appetite for risk taking. I don't know though, in terms of how that, I kind of suspect that there's something similar to the sort of logic of sports betting and these other types of gamified platforms too for gambling for some of these types of financial behaviors. And there I would expect that, it maybe corresponds with more of an appetite for risk taking. I don't know for sure though. So I don't know. I'll have to kind of defer to the experts on that specific question.
Anecdotally, I think that the rise in sports gambling appears to be sort of concentrated among people who listen to the same podcasts I do, because that's all the ads that I get now are sports gambling, regardless of the topic.
And how's it going for you?
It's good. I'm up. I have a couple on the Monday night games tonight. I can't say who. No, I don't. For all of my editors watching this, I do not sports gamble. But okay, here's what I'm building to. Imagine that you are coming from either sort of a center left or a center right. You're building a new party, you're building a new argument to try to win a campaign, much like the DLC. And you're trying to make a policy basket to appeal to today's American middle class on sort of investment grounds in the same way the DLC did. What would you talk about? How would you be different from that?
Oh, that's a good question. So
we're not trying to preempt Jacob's speech, but maybe.
Yeah, no, there's a question of what you think they should do and what you think they would do.
What should they do?
What should they do? I think that I would start by sort of thinking about some of the problems that haven't been solved by this sort of reliance on investment. So the idea was that sort of promoting more investment using policy or just even kind of rhetoric, but trying to get more people to become stakeholders would have these political solutions. It would sort of reduce people's demands for redistributive social policies. It would sort of sidestep some of the challenges. So one of the reasons that they do this is they also kind of, and this is the DLC, this is also Republicans, they say this will address the racial wealth gap too. That hasn't changed. There's like 10 to 1, I think, or sort of white households still have 10 times the wealth as Black households. So, it didn't solve that problem. It doesn't seem to have solved the sort of social safety net problem to the extent that, again, most people approaching retirement, even if the sort of numbers are higher now, the actual values of their accounts are not high enough to substitute for, still need Social Security. It's very good that they have that. So I would probably start by thinking, instead of, the goal being to come up with an investment policy, I would think about what were the sort of intentions, like the intended consequences back then of embracing this type of policy strategy. And then I would think, were those realized, right? Often we think about like unintended consequences, but I think in this case, it's valuable to think about, well, what were the intended consequences and did they actually happen? How did they shake out? And if they weren't realized, I think that you can think about these in terms of, sometimes activate, sometimes sort of drawing from like more financial kinds of policies, or sometimes that might be a way to kind of move the needle to kind of solve some of these, but might not be appropriate at all in some circumstances too. So I would probably start by thinking about the underlying sort of needs and demands that they thought those were fulfilling. What I think they actually would do is be like, oh, we're going to go on crypto for everybody. I don't actually know if that's true, but you did see that in 2024, right? It was something that a lot of people, like 2/3 of the public, thinks crypto is a bad idea. They don't think it's trustworthy. And both political parties, though, had sort of a crypto platform too, because they also wanted to make sure that they were there are industry issues as well, but in terms of voters, they wanted to make sure that they sort of said something to appeal to what they thought, was a constituency that they also need to vote for them.
And then one last thing, and then we'll toss it to the crowd. And this has been great. I mean, one of the real pleasures of interviewing a political scientist is that your answers are much more concise than most economists I interview, which I really appreciate. No offense to any economists in the crowd. I spent many years interviewing economists and loved them dearly, but they are not the most concise people as a people. But my final question is that you and I were talking before this about how different Germans see investment from Americans, and also how different sort of like the social safety net is here, the amount of pension, the sort of reliance, the security. Do you think if you offered Americans straight up a trade from like their investment society and like appreciating home values and everything to a much more German style system, they would take it?
I'm going to make a speculative answer. And I would think, when you, again, sort of, there are the sort of numbers of sort of broad participation and high participation. But when you delve into what people actually say, there is still a lot of evidence of anxiety that comes from having to, say, be responsible for decisions about how your retirement is invested and what happens to it. So surely not everybody, but I think that there's probably a lot of people who might take that. I'm not going to give you a precise answer.
No, that was a very precise answer.
I don't have one.
Good.
I'm
it gave me an
speculating,
answer.
But I think that people say that they feel anxious. They say that they do some of this stuff out of necessity. So I think if that necessity were taken away, there might be people might take that option.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. This was great. Love to hear some questions from the crowd. So if you all have questions, please raise your hands, and I think we will find you. We'll start back there.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I would be interested if you could perhaps differentiate this group of investors a bit more. And have you also looked at the group of Americans who are not investing?
No, I haven't in this project, and that's a really good point. I've been more focused on sort of the percentages and groups that are, but even kind of beyond that, the way that elected officials and some of the market makers like John Bogle and Vanguard kind of thought about this too. They were always thinking about who they could capture and not necessarily that other side. I thought about that question to some extent in the earlier periods that I'm studying, just because there what you see are these efforts by a bunch of different people in sort of like the financial industry to say, oh, well, there actually is a market for this here. Investment is, it's out of reach for most people. It requires sort of these relationships that don't make sense or kind of opaque, a little bit intimidating, and maybe more people would be interested in having like a brokerage account or something like that if it was just made a little bit easier, again, sort of democratized in the language that a lot of them were using. But I don't have a good sense of like the specific, whether what specific features at the time or factors at the time predicted, who was in and out of that group.
Are there still big divides along income and race?
So and it depends, and this gets to your question, thank you too, of sort of who, how to disaggregate. So if you're thinking about things like crypto, so cryptocurrency is disproportionately younger people. Disproportionately male, something like 25% of males say they have some, and it doesn't mean that they are all in at all, or it could be that they did something that they on a lark like 5 years ago just happened to put some money and invest something and don't pay attention to it. But about 25%, it's 10% of women. There tend to be a little bit higher income, so they're not the lowest. They're tend to be kind of well off, and disproportionately Asian Americans, and then African Americans, males, disproportionately invest in crypto relative to other forms of investment like index funds or mutual funds. But that's a little bit, I guess, different. But so, there are differences across these categories. Some things appeal much more to young people. Some things maybe appeal to young people because they're for social reasons, right? They're sort of actually learning about these through social media platforms, through podcasts or what have you. And so that's how they get interested in the first place. And that's kind of how they use them too, right? Sometimes these are used more for entertainment than for and as a concerted, retirement strategy or something like that.
All right, next question.
Thank you very much for this amazing talk. I mean, it's really great to see how the works of a capitalist society are presented, and of course, through the lens of comparative economics, that is interesting for me, like how an equity-based society like the US can compare with a credit-based society like Germany. So my question, I have two questions, quick. So how does your story explain Trump?
Yeah.
How does your story explain the victory of, because if we're really talking about how the Americans become capitalists,
Yeah.
how can this narrative help us understand what's happening now? And the second is, what are the conditions under which perceptions of financial risk shape political preferences?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. So, yeah, how does this explain Trump, which I think is the big question that every political scientist is asked when they present. So, I mean, one way to think about the rising appeal of Trump is that, and there was a pretty well documented backlash after the financial crisis, right? And so in the U.S., that's something that was intricately tied to the housing market. It was a foreclosure crisis that spurred it. Some of the same sort of policies, and I didn't talk as much about the housing side, although I do work on that as well. But the thing about using sort of the tools of government to support investment, and in this case, in housing, is that when something goes really wrong, you can blame the government or you can blame the people that might have been helped by that too. And so that kind of helped to fuel some of the narrative and some of the resentment that came out of the crisis. But the other thing too is people just saw a huge decrease in their standards of living, right? This increased, it wasn't just a housing crisis, it became an unemployment crisis as well. And so I think it's something in some ways, I think we want everything to tie, somehow explain Trump. And I think this does in some ways explain sort of why you saw the appetite for something very different, something somewhat nihilist even in the wake of the financial crisis. I won't say that explains it entirely, though. I'm trying to remember your other question.
How does appetite for risk correlate to political preference?
Yeah, how does appetite for risk correlate to political preferences? You might know better than I do on the empirical side. I can say that, here, just thinking about what these political entrepreneurs thought. So strategists in the Bush campaign thought that if they sort of, if they courted more sort of voters who already had sort of who are already in the stock market, or maybe if they encouraged more people to invest, that would actually change their outlook. It would make them more supportive of sort of deregulationary kind of politics or policies, and of the sort of political policy agenda that Bush and his party had in mind. That was a theory. I don't know that. I mean, again, we can see what happened in the aftermath. It's a financial crisis. There was the rise of Trump. So there's the contrast between the theory of what people thought. They thought this would make people both more risk-taking and sort of more, Republican at the time. Did that happen? Probably not.
And I will just add that in the early days of the first Trump administration in Washington, if you talked to Democratic policy hands and a lot of sort of more junior members of the Obama administration, there was this general sense that they had made a huge error by bailing out banks but not homeowners to a much larger degree. If you talk to Tim Geithner, he very much disagrees with that. And there were all these reasons why they didn't do much more aggressive, like foreclosure prevention, and they did a lot, but they didn't do much more aggressive. And I wrote about this a couple of times. There was like this real theory that was like the cardinal sin of Obama era policymaking, was that they had not done more to help the investor, the people who levered up huge to get.
And the bailouts for the banks were one of the sort of precipitating moments for the Tea Party too. Right. That was this sort of famous video of Jim Cramer, right? As sort of like a television financial journalist, kind of went off on the fact. Sorry, you're right. It's I feel bad for saying that about Kramer, but yeah, Rick Santelli. But this was a sort of a galvanizing moment sort of one of the origins of the Tea Party movement, though. Which I think there's you can draw a line from the Tea Party to Trump, even if the ideologies that are stated now seem pretty different. It's the same people.
Yeah. Okay. Next. Yeah. Go ahead and just.
Yes, I've got a question about tax policy, because capital gains on investments is taxed at a much lower rate than earned income. So does this play a role in more Americans becoming investors? I mean, it's less work than if you try to go out and work and make money.
That's why I'm becoming an investor. So, again, thinking to sort of this idea, and this is a little bit more maybe in the Bush era than in the Clinton era, there was a preference on the Republican side for like pretty low, to keep capital gains low. And so there might have been, a sense that encouraging sort of more people to participate might give them some skin in the game too, on that issue. In general, though, again, you got to think about sort of who's participating, what they are actually, how much are they actually, how much of their sort of money is actually involved in these, and why are they participating? I would be surprised if I would be surprised if some people don't absolutely strategically make calculations based on whether, how they're going to be taxed. And in fact, sociologists have looked at this too, and they've tried to figure out, because again, it's not just policymakers who are sort of talking about this change in sort of mindset, this idea that Americans seem to be developing a more financialized mindset, seem to be thinking more about risks, calculating more, sort of, thinking about their own sort of portfolios and what have you. And so what they found, this sociologist Neil Fligstein and Adam Goldstein, is that it's true for upper middle class Americans. It is not true for poorer Americans. That's not something that's driving their financial behavior. But for upper middle class Americans, they are thinking about sort of how to optimize. And so there, I would be very surprised if the tax implications didn't matter. But then again, with sort of people who see this as sort of like a game, or just sort of investing small amounts of money for fun with their friends, and they learned about it on a podcast or what have you, I doubt that that's what's going on there.
Chloe, thanks for a great talk. I have kind of a double question. And I want to go a little further upstream from where you started the story. It seems, when I think of how Americans became investors, it seems to me like the first decisive step was making mortgage interest deductible. Would you, first of all, I would ask you if you would agree with that, because that, of course, made home ownership, a public goal, a real goal of the U.S. government. And the second part of the question is, it seems to me to some extent, Americans were forced to be, or a lot of Americans were forced to become investors by the fact that most employers in the U.S. hated having pension liabilities, and simply, found a regulatory way out in which they could create the 41K, or the 401K as more properly referred to. I mean, I remember when I started working for Time Incorporated in like 1998. I was like, oh, I got a pension. And I was like, no, I gotta fill out all these forms and figure out which funds to invest in. And I never worked in a single place where there was a pension available, and that includes the U.S. government. So it seems like we perforce became a country of investors because it was convenient to corporate capital.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Jacob Hacker is not here, but he's written a lot on the great risk shift and the sort of the shift in many social risks, but in particular, the sort of risks of retirement and like, how are you going to make those decisions? How are you going to save from employers to employees? There's no doubt that that is what drove this. And I talk about that too. And sort of, the part where this isn't a disagreement at all, actually, but what I'm interested in is how policymakers then kind of, well, they took that as the given that people are going to be doing this. They're going to be invested more in they're more responsible for investing their own retirement savings, making those decisions, what have you. So let's kind of turn this into like these lemons into lemonade and try to sort of see if we can build on that, right? Sort of get people to just think about themselves as investors. Maybe that kind of solves the fact they're going to anyway. So yeah, I think that's right. I don't think there are many people who would disagree with that assessment at all. It was not, and this is again why people don't like that they're forced to make these decisions. I don't feel comfortable making a lot of these decisions, and I've been thinking about this for a long time. On the home mortgage interest deduction thing, that is more complicated because when the tax code was introduced in 1916, all credit was deductible. So that included home mortgage deduction, but it also included anything else. And that was because at the time it was just really difficult to figure out the sort of like, well, what's a business income? And they were just trying to figure out how to make this less complicated. And so it wasn't until 1986 with the Reagan tax, with these sort of changes in the tax code, that all of the other credit deductions. So by that point, you could even deduct your credit card debt or interest. It wasn't until 1986 that all of those other sort of ways of deducting interest were removed, but home mortgages stayed. And so it's kind of an accidental deduction to that extent. It's hard to say that its existence in the 30s had that much to do with the rapid rise of homeownership versus a lot of other things like government policies to create a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, which very different than the sort of German way of financing housing. But what it did mean in the 80s was that it helped to create a huge opportunity for home equity lending, because then you could borrow against the equity, and that would be treated differently in terms of your taxes. And so it helped to spur that market for second mortgages. It helped to sort of enable what had been a really kind of considered a shady sort of second mortgage, third mortgage, fourth mortgage industry to rebrand itself as the home equity loan industry. And so yeah, that part does relate to the interest deduction, but its history is it hasn't always played the role that it kind of came to play.
I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. Anybody?
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I have a European question. So does the investor identity of the U.S. Electorate affect its attitudes towards how Europe would be affected by the tax policy and so on, or is that not on the radar?
Does the investor identity affect attitudes towards tax policy?
I was just thinking that they would probably be affected by stock market movements in other countries, and so they could consider the more global effects of U.S. policy. And I was wondering whether that plays a role at all, or. I
hate to end on a question I don't have a good answer to. It's a really good question. I'm just not sure. I think it depends a little bit on sort of who you're thinking about, because again, it's a pretty complicated set of sort of mental tasks you have to do to think about what all of those sort of downstream consequences might be, and then to make decisions about how you're going to vote or what kinds of policies you might support. But like the woman over here had pointed to, for some people, some people are really motivated in that way. I don't know though how, it's not something that I've looked into, and I can't think of anyone who has, but it's a really good question.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. And Chloe, thank you. This is so great.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Really
Great.
fun. Yeah.